From the Earth to the Moon. Chapter 10.
One enemy against
5 millions of friends. The American public took great interest in the least details of the gun
club's enterprise. It followed the committee debates day by day.
The most simple preparations for this great experiment.
The questions of
figures it provoked. The mechanical difficulties to be solved. All excited popular opinion to the highest pitch. More than a year would elapse between the commencement of the work and its completion, but the interval would not be void of excitement. The place to be chosen for the boring, the casting the metal of the Columbiad, its perilous loading, all this was more than necessary to excite public curiosity. The projectile,
once fired,
would be out of sight in a few seconds. Then what would become of it? How it would reach the moon? None but a few privileged persons would see with their own eyes. Thus, then, the preparations for the experiment and the precise details of its execution constituted their real source of interest. In the meantime, the purely scientific attraction of the enterprise was all at once heightened by an incident.
It is known what numerous legions of admirers and friends the Barbicane.
But, notwithstanding the number and
importance of the majority,
it was not destined to be unanimous. One man, one out of all the United States, protested against the gun club. He attacked it violently on every occasion. And, for human nature is thus constituted, Barbicane was more sensitive to this one man's opposition than to the applause of all the others. Nevertheless, he well knew the motive of this antipathy, from whence came this solitary enmity, why it was personal and of ancient date. Lastly, in what rivalry it had taken root. The president of the gun club had never seen this persevering enemy. Happily, for the meeting of the two men would certainly have had. This rival was a savant like Barbicane, a proud, enterprising, determined, and violent character, a pure Yankee. His name was Captain Nicholl. He lived in Philadelphia. No one is ignorant of the curious struggle which went on during their Federal War between the projectile and ironclad vessels. The former, destined to pierce the latter determined not to be pierced. Thence came a radical transformation in the navies of the two continents. Cannon, balls and iron plates struggled for supremacy, the former getting larger as the latter got thicker. Ships armed with formidable guns went into the fire under shelter of their invulnerable armor. The Merrimac, Monitor, Ram Tennessee, and Wechhausen shot enormous projectiles after having made themselves proof against their projectiles of other ships. They did to others what they would not have others do to them, an immoral principle upon which the whole art of war
is based.
Now Barbicane was a great caster of projectiles, and Nicholl was an equally great forger of plate armor. The one cast night and day at Baltimore, the other forged day and night at Philadelphia. Each followed an essentially different current of ideas. As soon as Barbicane had invented a new projectile, Nicholl invented a new plate armor. The president of the gun club passed his life in piercing holes, the captain in preventing him doing it. Hence a constant rivalry which even touched their persons. Nicholl appeared in Barbicane's dreams as an impenetrable ironclad against which he split, and Barbicane in Nicholl's dreams appeared like a projectile which
ripped him up.
Still, although they ran along two diverging lines, these savants would have ended by meeting each other in spite of all the axioms in geometry. But then it would have been on a dual field. Happily for these worthy citizens, so useful to their country, a distance of from 50 to 60 miles separated them. and their friends put such obstacles in their way that they never met. At present it was not clearly known which of the two inventors held their palm. The results obtained rendered a just decision difficult. It seemed that in the end armor plate would have to give way to
projectiles.
Nevertheless, competent men had their doubts. At the latest experiments, the cylindro-conical shots of Barbicane had no more effect than pins upon Nichols' armor plate. That day the forger of Philadelphia believed himself victorious, and henceforth had nothing but disdain for his rival. But when, later on, Barbicane substituted simple howitzers of 600 pounds for conical shots, the captain was obliged to go down in his own estimation. In fact, these projectiles, though of mediocre velocity, plate, things had reached this point and victory seemed to rest with their projectile. When the war ended the very day that nickel terminated a plate, it was a masterpiece of its kind. It defied all the projectiles in the world. The captain had it taken to the Washington Polygon and challenged the president of the gun club to pierce it.
Barbicane, peace having been made,
would not attempt the experiment. Then Nickel, in a rage, offered to expose his armor
plate to the shock
of any kind of projectile, solid, hollow, round, or conical.
The president,
who was determined not to compromise his last success, refused. Nickel, excited by this unqualified obstinacy, tried to tempt Barbicane by leaving him every advantage. He proposed to put his plate 200 yards from the gun. Barbicane still refused. At 100 yards, not even at 75, at 50, then, cried the captain, through the newspapers, at 25 yards, and I will be behind it.
Barbicane answered that even if Captain Nickel would be in front of it,
he would not fire any more. On this reply, Nickel could no longer contain himself. He had recourse
to personalities.
He insinuated cowardice, that the man who refuses to fire a shot from a cannon is very nearly being afraid of it.
That,
in short, the artillerymen who fight now at 6 miles distance have
prudently substituted mathematical formulae for individual courage,
and that there is as much bravery required to quietly wait for a cannon
ball
behind armor plate as to send it according to all the rules of science. To these insinuations Barbicane answered nothing. Perhaps he never knew about them, for the calculations of his great enterprise absorbed him entirely.
When he made his famous communication to the Gun Club,
the anger of Captain Nickel reached its maximum. Mixed with it was supreme jealousy, and a sentiment of absolute powerlessness. How could he invent anything
better than a Columbiad 900 feet long?
What armor plate could ever resist a projectile of 30,000 pounds?
Nickel was at first crushed by this
cannon ball.
Then he recovered and resolved to crush the proposition by the weight of his best arguments. He therefore violently attacked the labors of the Gun Club. He sent a
number of letters to the newspapers,
which they did not refuse to
publish. He tried to demolish Barbicane's work scientifically. Once the war begun,
he called reasons of every kind to his aid. Reasons, it must
be acknowledged, often specious and of bad metal.
Firstly,
Barbicane was violently attacked about his figures. Nickel tried to prove by B the falseness of his formulae, and he accused him of being ignorant of the rudimentary principles of ballistics, amongst other errors, and according to Nickel's own calculations, it
was impossible to give anybody a velocity of 12,000
yards a second. He
sustained
algebra in hand, that even with that velocity a projectile thus heavy would never pass the limits of the terrestrial atmosphere. It would not even go 8 leagues. Better still, granted the velocity, and taking it as sufficient, the shot would not resist the pressure of their gas developed by the combustion of 1,600,000 pounds of powder. And even if it did resist that pressure, it at least would not support such a temperature. It would melt as it issued from the Columbiad, and would fall in red, hot rain on the heads of the imprudent spectators. Barbicane paid no attention to these attacks, and went on with his work.
Then Nicholl considered the question in its other aspects,
without speaking of its uselessness from all other points of view. He looked upon the experiment as exceedingly dangerous, both for the citizens who
authorized so condemnable a spectacle by their presence,
and for the towns near the deplorable cannon. He also remarked that if their projectile did not reach its destination, a result absolutely
impossible,
it was evident that it would fall onto the earth again, and
that the fall of such a mass multiplied by the square of its velocity would singularly damage some point on the globe.
Therefore, in such a circumstance, and without any restriction being put upon the rights of free citizens, it was one of those cases in which the intervention of government became necessary,
and the safety of all must not be
endangered for the good pleasure of a single individual. It will be seen to what exaggeration Captain Nicholl allowed himself to be carried. Nobody took any notice of his Cassandra prophecies. They let him exclaim as much as he liked, till his throat was sore if he pleased. He had constituted himself the defender of a cause lost in advance. He was heard but not listened to,
and he did
not carry off a single admirer from the president of the Gun Club, who
did not even take the trouble to refute his rival's arguments.
Nicholl, and not being able to fight for his opinion, resolved to pay for it. He therefore proposed in the Richmond Enquirer a series of bets conceived in these terms and in an increasing proportion. He bet that 1. The funds necessary for the Gun Club's enterprise would not be forthcoming. $1,000. That the casting of a cannon of 900 feet was impracticable and would not succeed. $2,000. 3. That it would be impossible to load the Columbiad, and that their pyroxyle would ignite spontaneously under the weight of the projectile. $3,000. 4. That the Columbiad would burst at the first discharge. $000. 5. That the projectile would not even go 6 miles, and would fall a few seconds after its discharge. $5,000. It will be seen that the captain was risking an important sum in his invincible obstinacy. No less than $15,000 were at stake. Notwithstanding the importance of the wager, he received on the 19th of October a sealed packet of superb laconism, couched in these terms: Baltimore, October 18th. Done. Barbicane.